Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova.
This week on Heroic Media, an Australian couple abandons their surrogate baby upon discovering that he has Down syndrome.
Catholics dispel the myths surrounding the dangers of receiving chemotherapy during pregnancy.
And abortion advocates shift away from the term pro-choice.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media. So here at Heroic Media, we explore news headlines that deal with a lot of very foundational moral issues. And a lot of the stories that we'll cover deal with issues like family, or topics like family, marriage, and life.
Exactly, and those tend to focus around the issues of abortion,
Right.
euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Exactly.
So Patrick, what's our first story for the day?
All right, in our first story, an Australian couple who used a surrogate to have children left one of their children with a surrogate mother after they discovered that their baby had Down syndrome. So this is kind of a combination of several different moral issues, I guess, that we come across. One of them is kind of ties in with in vitro fertilization or surrogacy also, as well as abortion and Down syndrome and just basically the value of human life. So there's a lot of things that we can talk about. But what were your initial reactions to this?
I was absolutely stunned to see that this happened. I mean, this was very much a wanted or planned child, if you make those distinctions. You know, This was not an accidental pregnancy or any of, some of those excuses that people use. What happened is this couple hired a surrogate, and the way that works is they take the egg and the sperm and they unite them outside of the body, and then they put them into the womb of a different woman. This is called the surrogate mother.
Exactly.
And so then she has the baby growing in her womb for 9 months, she delivers the baby, and then generally by contract she is obligated to give the baby to the couple who is purchasing it, essentially, that she's contracted with. And
exactly.
so this leads to a lot of problems. In this case, it's generally done if a woman is older, or she doesn't think that she's fertile, if she thinks there'll be some kind of complications. Sometimes homosexual couples with two men will do this. There's a variety of reasons, but it can lead to a lot of complications, and this is probably one of the more appalling cases that has hit the media.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't know, for this particular story, we don't know really anything about the parents that took. So there was twins that were born, by the way, and a boy and a girl. And they took the girl, but once they realized that the boy had Down syndrome, that they would just abandon the baby.
Abandoned him.
And so it's pretty sad. I think that's a distinction to be made too. That I think you already pointed out. That's a good point. Is that this isn't like other cases where it's like there's an unwanted child or whatever, and as we know, there's never an unwanted child, but with that scenario with them. And so it really put this surrogate mother in kind of a bind, right? Because it was like, she was like, I carried this baby with me for 9 months, I care about him. And she actually said those, I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what she said. And I think that's one of the dangers of surrogacy also, is that no matter how unattached you want to be, there is that link between your children and yourself when you grow them in your womb for 9 months, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And so I think that's can be one of the difficult things about surrogacy, even not in cases like this where the woman was left with this child.
Absolutely.
So.
I mean, pregnancy is a huge bonding time for the mother and the baby. And I mean,
Yeah.
you have kids, so even as a father, you're not carrying the child, but when you see the ultrasound, when you feel the baby kick, there's all these different things. It really is a bonding time. And the studies actually have shown now that the mother's womb is able to affect the baby genetically, even if it's not her genetic biological child.
Right.
Some of the ways that the genes are expressed and turned on and off is actually, they think, a contributing factor is the environment of the womb. So in some ways, this woman could be contributing to the characteristics of this baby. And so here she is, and she's saying, the quotes that were attributed to her were absolutely beautiful. She said, "I love this baby. He's been in my tummy for 9 months." And One of the other things she said, I've never felt angry at them or hated them. I'm always willing to forgive them. She said that about the parents. And so she said, you know, I'm willing to adopt this baby as my own. She's very poor. She has 2 of her other kids. This brings up a whole other issue. She's poor. She's selling her body. She's renting her womb.
Right.
Because she's very poor. And is that exploiting women? You know, that's a whole separate topic.
Yeah, exactly.
But she says, I'm willing to take care of this kid. I can't afford his medical conditions. He has some other health conditions, heart problems. And this was absolutely incredible. Someone set up a fundraising campaign online to try to help cover this baby's medical expenses. And in less than 2 weeks, they had raised over $200,000, which is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to do, especially when people choose life, right? I mean, because I don't know what goes, you know, through people's minds in that situation, but I could definitely see instances where people would just straight up throw that kid out in the street and let the kid die, or worse, right? Other ways of discarding of this human person, right? Because that's what society does a lot of times nowadays, even after the child is born, you know, and shortly after, probably not quite this far, but still. And I think that showing how to live our Christian faith by supporting a mother who chose life, I think that that's a good thing. But there's so many. You mentioned financial gain, and I like to get back to that a little bit. So I think that's a good point, because I feel like sometimes people here in the U.S. especially, where we're not really, I mean, we're one of the richest countries in the world, right? So people don't really have true financial burdens here, generally speaking. But some people in the United States, I think, will have this attachment like, oh, I just want to help these people out. And that's why I'm doing it. But we have to remember, too, there's usually this financial gain involved, right? And actually in this province in southeast of Bangkok, it's actually illegal to take money for it. So this transaction, in this case, the surrogacy was done illegally. And so because there was money involved, and also because the laws there state that this person has to be, that's the surrogate has to be related. And so they're breaking the laws in those cases too. But I think we have to remember that when it comes down to monetary issues, and she received $14,900 to be the surrogate, which is a lot of money, especially for her and what she needs. But I think we have to remember that we can't put these economic things ahead of the moral implications. We have to remember that there's human beings involved. And one thing that was nice was that she realized, I don't know if she realized that part, but she had enough in her heart, love in her heart to care for this child, and I think that that's awesome.
Yeah, and one thing it said is that they went to Thailand because they couldn't find any woman in Australia who was willing to do this. Yeah. So you just have to look and say, here's a poor woman who's willing to do this, and is she being taken advantage of?
That's a good point.
And they say Thailand was saying, okay, well, we're going to try to regulate this industry better, regulate commercial surrogacy. Well, what is commercial about surrogacy? What's being sold? What is this as an industry? I think those are some of the questions that this raises that we should really be asking ourselves.
Absolutely, a lot of questions, and I'm sure there'll be more cases like this, unfortunately, but real interesting to see how they unfold. All right, for our next story, a pregnant woman who's diagnosed with cancer is usually only given 2 options: either have an abortion and then get treatment for the cancer, or wait until after you have the baby and then get cancer treatment. But what most people don't know is that oftentimes there's a third option. And so this third option is really interesting. People usually don't think about it like, oh, you can get chemotherapy during the pregnancy. And so this isn't available all of the time.
Right.
But there are cases where you can receive chemotherapy and it doesn't affect the baby.
Right. And it's actually throughout the majority of the pregnancy, according to what the research seems to be saying.
Yeah.
And this was really interesting because in this case, the case in the story, it was a 20-week pregnant woman.
Yes.
And she goes into the doctor, and she happened to be a molecular biologist.
Right.
And so she was actually able to do the research herself, and the doctor said, here are your options. You can either wait until the baby's born, or you can abort the baby and start your treatment now.
Right.
And she actually had the ability to say, let me look into this, and then to say, no, these are not my only options. But I think this just shows that most women who don't have the capacity to do that, who don't have the knowledge, who don't have the ability, they would be scared that, they're given this false option. You have 2 choices.
Right.
And somebody's going to be, devastatingly harmed from this.
Yes.
And so I think this just shows there's a need to be cautious and to be vigilant and to be aware and to say, is there a life-affirming option here? In this case, there absolutely is.
Right, and I think we have to remember that because so many times we just take professionals' advice on things and the government's advice, or they issue, laws, and just because you received advice from someone who's a professional, or there's a law that's a certain way, like homosexual marriage, for instance, it doesn't mean that that's the truth, or that there's other options. There aren't any other options out there. So I think that that's one thing we have to remember too, is God gave you a brain and an intellect and a will to go search out the other options. And I'm sure she's very glad that she did. This type of treatment has been available apparently for like the last 20 years.
20 years.
And I mean, before I read this article, I had no idea that that was an option. And I guess I hadn't really thought about it, because most of the time, women that are pregnant don't get cancer.
It's rare. Yeah,
very
that's what
rare. But I can see why the typical OBGYN doesn't know about this.
Exactly.
It's just very rare. I'm sure they don't train them on it. And so it's just nice to, I guess, know that there's another option. And so often, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, it seems like, at least in my viewpoint, it's like whenever there's a problem, right, there's something going on, it's like the first thing out when it comes to pregnancy is like, okay, let's just take the easy route out and we'll kill the baby.
Same
basically.
thing with the Down syndrome story, it's just, oh, there's a problem, okay, abortion.
Exactly.
And I think that's why a lot of OBGYNs, in addition to the fact that many of them don't have experience with it, because pregnancy and cancer going together is rare, when it does come, they just think of abortion and they don't even think of other options, they don't even look into it.
Yeah.
But in reality, these studies have found that these drugs, many of the chemotherapy and treatments and drugs do not increase the risk of miscarriage, and they're safe for women in the second and third trimesters.
Right.
And this is what the American Society of Clinical Oncology says. They say that during the second and third trimesters, some types of chemotherapy may be given without necessarily harming the fetus, because the placenta acts as a barrier that prohibits the drugs to pass through, or just in small amounts. And so if the planned chemotherapy includes a drug that is not safe during one stage of the pregnancy, sometimes the doctor can substitute another drug. So this is being recognized by the medical community, but just individual doctors don't realize it a lot of times.
Right, and there's not really any risks with this too, as long as you determine that this, with your doctor, that the situation is good. Apparently, one of the only risks is like having early contractions, which can happen if you're stressed out anyway as a pregnant woman. So it's not a big deal, and they're not the kind that actually produce, anything worthwhile. Like they don't actually cause you to have the baby early or anything. Now, this brings up another topic, which is just that there's kind of a confusion amongst some pro-lifers, particularly Catholic pro-lifers, that you must endure as much suffering as you can in order to become holy. What are your thoughts on that?
I thought that was a really interesting point that this author brought up, that somehow the idea of tragedy equals holiness, that the faithful route is always the most painful one. And I think it's important to remember that we are called to embrace suffering when it comes into our lives, and that pick up our cross and follow Jesus. Suffering is part of our lives. But that doesn't mean that we have to look for the suffering if there's a life-affirming option that's not going to. I mean, there are serious risks in saying, I'm not going to treat my cancer until after the baby's born. That could result in your death and the baby's death. So I think that there's definitely a balance to discern God's will and to look for the life-affirming option.
There is, and I think you're right. Like, we don't go seeking out suffering and pain, but if we do come across suffering and pain, we don't take the most painful route or anything like that just to create pain. But when we do come across pain, we need to take up our cross and bear it.
Absolutely.
All right.
Coming up after the break, we will talk with a guest about a New York Times article finding a drop in the phrase pro-choice.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova.
In our next story, a recent article in the New York Times found that the phrase pro-choice is dropping out of use. There are suggestions that it no longer connects with young people, although a clear alternative has not yet been established.
Very interesting topic. I hadn't realized, I guess I haven't been paying attention too much, but that it is changing. So.
It is actually. And I had the opportunity earlier this week to speak with Lynn Grandon, who is the director of the Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of Denver. She's also the executive director of the Lighthouse Women's Center here in Denver. So let's take a look at what she had to say.
All right.
Lynn, thank you so much for being here with me today and taking the time to give us your comments.
You're welcome.
So there's a piece here in the New York Times that's saying that the phrase pro-choice is becoming a lot less common, a lot less used. What is your response to that? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's quite wonderful because we have watched the pro-life movement and the pro-choice movement go back and forth for all of these years, and now we're starting to see this inroad where they are realizing that maybe that isn't so appropriate to say, and so they're trying to make this shift, which is rather thrilling to a lot of people in the pro-life community.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is behind the movement away from pro-choice? Do you think ultrasound technology, being able to see that choice, has something to do with it, or do you have other thoughts on what that might be?
Well, a lot of people in the pro-life community have said we offer better choices and we want you to make an informed choice. We've used that word, and I think that that is bothering them. So they want to get to something more innocuous to kind of lull the masses once again. And we've seen that happen before in human history, and even now in the beginning of this movement when Roe v. Wade and abortion became legal, where immediately they wanted to be, I'll say, deceptive in their verbiage that they use to try to make things less appalling to the general public, like phrases, products of conception, things like that, to deny the humanity of the unborn. And so I think it's that same ploy again.
Yeah, and if we look at some of these phrases that they're shifting to, there's not, a clear alternative that's being used, but this article was just saying women's health and economic security. Those just seem so vague and so removed from the actual reality of what abortion is. It just seems like we're moving further and further away. We don't want to talk about abortion. Let's just talk about women's health and economic security, very sort of vague terms.
Yes, and we know that abortion is not good medicine. It's not good for women's health. We could cite for hours here all of the things, detrimental effects of abortion on a woman's body, her health, her psyche, her future, her family. All of those things can be cited, and abortionists know that now, so it's almost like if they can be as deceptive as possible, they could still lull people into believing that what they're doing for them is good, but we know that none of it is good.
Reproduction is not bad. It's not a disease to be prevented or treated.
And
that's a good thing.
And
pregnancy is not a disease, which is how it's so often treated and so
Yes.
often seen.
Well said.
Now, Lynn, you are also the executive director of Lighthouse Women's Center in Denver. So what is the mindset behind the approach that you have to women's health care?
We do say to the young women that come in, we want you to make an informed decision. Let us explain to you what's happening in your body. We'll just give you objective information. We'll show them early human development. Many times that's very troubling to them because they've never seen humanity in such small stages. And many women have said to us, and this is very poignant, if I would have known then what I know now, I would have made a different choice.
Wow.
And that's really tough. So of course we also offer free ultrasound imaging, and that playful child in the womb often just secures it because she sees it objectively for herself, and that maternal instinct kicks in when she sees her unborn child.
And that's so interesting, that phrase, I would have made a different choice, because the whole idea, this for years, pro-choice, but that there's no effort to show an ultrasound to teach about fetal development. There is no real choice there. So really it is the pro-life side that's offering the real choice and the real alternatives.
That's right. We offer better choices, and we know that our choices involve truth. And that's why we can be gracious, we don't have to be forceful, we don't have to be deceptive, because we know in the end and throughout eternity we're doing what's right.
Absolutely. If there is a woman who finds herself in a difficult, perhaps unexpected pregnancy, what are the life-affirming choices that she has? What are the options? What are the resources that are out there for her?
There's many, many centers throughout the United States that they can go to get free help, not just through that pregnancy, but all the way through the rest of her life. Catholic Charities here in Denver offers what we call a compassionate continuum of care for for whatever a woman needs and then her children subsequent to that, or she can consider adoption if she just feels like she's not the best thing for that baby at that time in her life.
Absolutely. Great. And so we can see there are options, there are true options, there are different choices, but they don't involve killing your child. They really involve affirming the life, doing what's best for the woman and her child, loving them both, caring for them both.
That's right. I often say to women that are very, very upset, I'll say, no matter what you're going through, no matter what your problem is, the answer is never kill your baby. And let us help you through this trial, through this challenge, and it works quite beautifully.
That's such a great approach to the pro-life movement. So, Lynn, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us.
You're more than welcome.
There's some interesting comments there. I really like what she had to say about like economic security, right? Because they're trying to redefine how their approach is and how people view them. So they're going away from pro-choice, and I think it's really, this whole economic security thing is really interesting to me, because we had the CEO of Catholic Charities here, Larry Smith, on the show before, and he talked about the real war on women, which is poverty, and how a lot of these decisions that women make actually end up leading them into poverty. And so I thought that was one of the things that stood out just based on conversations we've had before on this show. And I mean, what else did you think?
That's such a good point. I'm glad you made that, because economic security and abortion, you don't need abortion for economic security. There are so many things we can do to help women without killing their children. And in fact, abortion has devastating consequences for women, and it's not going to contribute to economic security.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought this was interesting. I found a quote from Dr. Charmaine Yost, who's the president and CEO of Americans United for Life. They're a group that works to help craft pro-life legislation. And she said, as exposure to the horror of abortion grows, more and more people identify as pro-life based on their concern for both mother and child. So I thought, just this idea that with technology, with ultrasounds, we can see what's actually happening here.
Yeah.
And the idea that this is an acceptable choice is just a sort of a turnoff. And so people say, they need to move to these more vague phrases, women's health, economic security, because we don't want to think about we don't want to think about what's actually happening there.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lynn also mentioned, reframing the word choice, basically. And I really like that she said that, because she was talking about when they're interacting with people, they say you need an informed choice. And I find myself using the word choice too when I'm talking about the pro-life side of things. So I think it's interesting how over time it's kind of morphed into, there's a choice on both sides, of course, right? And so you mentioned ultrasounds, and it's like, you get people more information and an informed choice, and they make the right decision. So.
There was a Gallup poll in 2012 that found Americans identifying as pro-choice reaching a record low of 41%. So there's absolutely hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll have one more story after the break.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. In our final story for today, the erotic novel 50 Shades of Grey continues to make headlines as a movie rendition is now underway. However, critics maintain that the book is not only pornographic, but normalizes violent, abusive relationships.
Wow. So I know a lot of people who have read the book. It seems like when it came out, I don't know, a few years ago now, everybody was reading it, right? And it was like, it was this very popular book, and now of course they're making a movie out of it, and it's like all this excitement is back and everybody's talking about it. And I've actually found it really interesting how women have been very divided on this. Like some of them are like super excited about it, and then some of which I would have expected to be excited about it are not. And so I find the reasons interesting. What, from a woman's perspective, what would you say about this movie?
Well, I haven't read the book, and I'm not going to watch the movie, but just from reading the reviews, reading about it, you can tell, this is a very problematic book for a number of reasons. And we have this phenomenon where the phrase mommy porn is what it's called. And what they're finding is a lot of middle-aged women and young women, both young and middle-aged women, reading these books and liking them, but finding that that they are erotic. This is pornography. There's very, very explicit descriptions, of, graphic descriptions of sex acts taking place here. And so it's not really that much different from pornography in, a magazine and a film. And so, and I know women who have read this book and who love it, but those same women would be appalled if their husbands were watching or looking at pornography. So there's a disconnect there.
There's a disconnect.
And I think it's important to recognize that when we're using descriptions or depictions of sexual acts, I mean, that's not how this is intended to be used. And so this is pornographic. It is morally problematic.
Yeah, and what do you think, you mentioned the word disconnect. Why do you think there's a disconnect? Have you been able to pinpoint it? Like, why?
I think part of it, I mean, the people that I've talked to who have read it have just said, oh, well, it's just, it's just fun. It's not a big deal. I think maybe they don't, because they think it's all fictional. There's not there's not actual people that they're seeing there in front
That's
of
a
them.
good point, actually, because once you bring it to a movie, right, there are even other actors. There's people involved, and like it makes it a little bit more real. That's a good point.
But I think, even setting that aside, something even worse here is just the violence. There's very violent portrayals of sexual activity here, and the problem with that is that it's normalizing it. It's shown in a positive light. It's shown as this man is abusive to the woman in the book, and he is actually, this is really interesting. There were some psychologists at Michigan State and Ohio State University that went through the book and laid out how the actions in it meet the Center for Disease Control's official definition of intimate partner violence. So the man is physically and sexually abusive of her. He pressures her when she doesn't want to give in to things, when she has boundaries that she doesn't want to cross. He gives her alcohol so that she'll give in to them.
Sounds like a great read. Great movie.
He psychologically intimidates her, threatens her, isolates her from her friends. The World Health Organization finds that 35% of women around the globe are affected by intimate partner violence. And that's what's being glorified in this book and normalized, is teaching girls and women it's okay if your husband or if your boyfriend is violent to you, is hurting you, is beating you for sexual gratification.
Yeah, and of course none of that is right. And I think that from a Christian perspective, we can't be watching those things and reading those things and still be thinking that we're in line with what Christ has taught us.
Absolutely.
And I think when we look at the Gospels, like for instance, Matthew 5:28, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. We have to remember that even when we imagine these things in our mind or think about other people, that we are committing sin, right? And even if it's a book or a video or any of this, we have to remember that we're violating moral law.
It is absolutely, absolutely true.
All right. That's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can check out more stories like the ones we discussed tonight.
That's it for this week. Until next time, please keep us in your prayers.
God bless.